don't forget these. If you've already made up your mind, I encourage you to take it and reflect upon it and ponder it and take your time with it. But if you've made up your mind, sign them and leave them with me. I could give you a copy of it, but I have to have it on file. Because since I do carry, my highest license is as a mujtahid. And I carry one in Shafi'i law and I carry one in Shiite law, in Ja'fari law. Not as a mujtahid mutlaq in Ja'fari law, but as what mujtahid fil madhab, as they call them, granted by mudarrisi. Consequently, I must keep strict record, which is something that unfortunately I was not, and I have to admit that I was not very careful with, and ask God forgiveness for that. That I must keep careful record of everyone I teach and everyone I issue a license to. I have issued no licenses except to jihad over the text of material taught in Arizona. In other words, I authorized them to teach the material that I taught in Arizona. Jihad, the certification does not cover any of this material because you have not been tested or verified. But my licenses obligate me to keep strict record of all students and all licenses issued, so that you carry its responsibility before God. Yeah, actually, I became convinced, that the reason that, I don't know if it's true, because I mean from a different, but I became convinced that the reason all these people seem to have gotten lost, it was punishment from Allah for flouting the rules. Now, I have to say, I don't because why would Allah punish me by having these people do crazy things? I mean, it's not fair to these people. That's one. The other thing is, my license, at least in the Sunni license, as a mujtahid, gives me the authority to change the rules according to discretion. Now they say, even if you're licensed out of protocol, you should not do so unless it's for exceptional reasons. One, age, the younger one is, the more confident one is, and so on. As you get older, you become less and less confident. And so, I think although technically authorized, but from sort of a moral perspective, it's the foolishness of young age, or being younger, thinking, if these jurists developed rules, well, why can't I develop new rules, and so on and so forth, which is silly, because I mean these rules develop over hundreds of years and many examples, and they build upon each other. I'm not saying that one should remain static, but one should take the heritage of others, the experiences of others, the mistakes and the successes that produce these rules very seriously, and only modify them, with great reserve. In other words, one should not be, I don't know, in my view, it's much better to change incrementally and very slowly than be sort of like rebellious and fanatic and so on about reform and all of that. Obviously, I'm over my Marxist phase, as you can see. Marxism says does not believe in incremental and small pieces of change at a time and so on. Any questions as to what we've covered? It's crucial because we're going to move on. It's crucial that if you go home, you don't have to do any readings. Often I will not announce which surah we're going to be reading beforehand. Sometimes I will, just to give you the benefit of reviewing it if you want. So there is no reading, there is no homework. But one thing I do advise you to do is to review your notes once you go home and make sure you understand, because if not, then you might get lost as we move on and not know what I'm referring to anymore. Yeah, go ahead. Well, there are two ways. One school says this would be a bit strange, at least for us today in the United States. One school says that Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim is a separate and independent surah in itself. So the obligation is to read Surah Al-Basmala, then Surah Al-Fatiha, and then Surah Qasira. Let's say you're praying, so you're actually reading three surahs. Surah Al-Basmala, Surah Al-Fatiha, Surah min al-Qur'an, or a part of the Qur'an. That's one school. They rely on this variety of evidence, none that I personally believe is particularly persuasive, but they rely on reports that the Prophet's practice was not to recite some verses of one chapter and stop, but he would recite, when he starts reciting verses from a certain chapter, he would complete. This is the same school that says you cannot read a part of a surah in a rak'ah. If you must read full surahs. So let's say you start al-Baqarah, you must read all of the Baqarah in the rak'ah. You can't read just a part of Baqarah. This is the same school that says that as well. And consequently, but Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, the Prophet ﷺ would often utter on its own. And they use that as one part of the evidence. They also have a report from Ibn al-Abbas, who said that he asked the Prophet, and the Prophet told him that Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim is a separate surah. The other school says that Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim is not a surah, and it is not a part of the Fatiha. But there is no question that there is a command to start everything by saying Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In other words, they do not negate the validity of Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, far from it. They just say it is not a part of the surah. It's just simply not a part of the surah. And it is not a part of the Qur'an. It is like many other things that we utter that come basically from the prophetic tradition, but it is not a part of the Qur'an in itself, except in Surah An-Naml, where it is a part of the text itself. So they simply say that although you must say it, it is not a part of the Qur'an. So how do they deal with the way, they would not start as we started today, by Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, what does Bism mean, what does Allah mean, and so on. They would start with Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. So they would talk, what does Alhamd mean, what does Allah mean, what does Rabbil Alameen, and so on. No, these are the ones that say it's not a surah. It's not a part of the Qur'an. It is a part of the traditions, it is mutawatir, you have to say it, but it is not a part of the Qur'an. That's the debate. Yeah.
If you subscribe to the belief that Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim is a part of Surah Al-Fatiha, and it is one whole with that included, and you subscribe to the belief that you should invoke Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim as a preamble before you recite any surah, then following that logic, wouldn't you then silently say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and then say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in effect, saying it twice? Would that make sense?
Well, let's say you're the Imam. Or you mean if you're the Imam or if you're not the Imam? If you're the Imam, because now you're going to start Al-Fatiha, so you say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and then you start reciting out loud Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Yes, because if you believe that you must say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim before starting anything, and you believe that Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim is part of Al-Fatiha, as one of the 7 verses, then you're absolutely right. But the first time you say it silently, because it's not a part of the Quran, so you say it quietly. In fact, that's my practice, because I follow actually this school. So when I say Allahu Akbar, I always go to myself, and then I start to say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim out loud. The important thing, I don't think it, at least in my view, it's not important which school you follow as long as you're consistent. You can't be whimsical about it. You can't just do something because you believe this is what you see other people do. But you must at least form to your own satisfaction if you want on this matter, and then be just consistent about it. Yeah. The reading what?
The reading
Oh, for the first one, Ibn Qayyim al-Juzay. Oh, there are several for this. This view was expressed by al-Baghawi. It was also expressed by al-Ghazali, the old Ghazali, Hamd Ghazali. In the contemporary age, it was championed very powerfully by two very famous people, Muhammad Abdu, you know Muhammad Abdu, and Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. That's because of language itself. They're absolutely right. The sighat fi'lan and fa'il. Fi'lan in Arabic always connotes a passing attribute, and fa'il always connotes a permanent attribute. It's absolutely right. But it is also right that Rahim connotes something being done. And even if you know Arabic and you hear it, you say, that sounds like something being done. And Rahman connotes something that's sort of like a static state. Now, I think the reason for the discrepancy is because Rahman is not an Arabic word. It's Hebrew. Consequently, when it came into Arabic, it created this type of dynamic because but the remarkable thing is, by standards of Hebrew, again, like every time the Qur'an uses Syriac or Aramaic or Persian or whatever, it's used in exactly the way it's supposed to be used. There's a Christian fellow in Egypt who wrote actually an essay about this that's very well known, about the Quranic use of Rahman according to Hebrew grammar. But anyway. Oh. Who's first?
Are there other mystical interpretations of the Sunnah, perhaps in Sufi traditions?
Oh, I mean, if you read actually the amount of material written in Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, like I told you, in our halaqa, our assigned reading, so to speak, because we would have assigned readings and things like that. I mean, it amounted to about, on Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim alone, it amounted to about 300 pages from different sources. And if you just go and you look at Tafsir al-Mizan by Qurtubi, and you look up Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, you'll find he has 30 pages on it. I am giving you the bare bones of, because you have Muslims talking about something for 1400 years. Of course you're gonna have all of that. It's not surprising. I mean, it's not surprising that if they love their religion and they love their book, they're going to talk about it and they're going to study it and they're going to analyze it. So there are all types of why, for example, the bi-ism or bism becomes really important, because the bism format, not bi-ism and then you just abridged it. The Arab hadith instead said that it's bi-ism and then you just abridged it into bism and just took the hamza out and threw it away. And so if you come and tell them bism is a word in itself, it's sam and ba, they say no, absolutely not. Yeah. Yeah, it's no, I'm sorry. It's sammama, not poison, and then ba للتفخيم وللأمر أو بمعنى قل. There are all types of mystical interpretations attributed to this whole formula, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. But you see, when it's like, if you study law or you study medicine or whatever, you take the essential legal doctrine or the essential medical doctrine, and then you leave the special cases to advanced stages. Then you specialize, and so on and so forth. So those who specialize in tafsir must study then all the different schools of thought and all this and that. Even I think those who specialize in law, because those specialized in law have to know Qur'an very well. I mean, they have to know Arabic very well, they have to know Qur'an very well. I mean, that's why the law is always the thing that took the longest to specialize in. Yeah, there's a lot. Hmm? It's sammama. It's, yeah, hold on. Sammama. Hold on. Sammima. Sammim. Sammim would be the form. Now, but sam. Yes, that's it. Yeah, because then it becomes sam. Sam. Yeah, that's the form of. Qir. Yeah. I told you. Yeah, qir, exactly. Yeah. Oh, Hassan al-Basri said you read it once in a prayer. The Kufans said no, it is, you just read the part of the Qur'an. But you see, again, there is something very strange, is that their evidence, the Kufan jurists had reports that the Prophet prayed without reciting the Fatiha. But here you look at the report. You have to look at the report. None of the reports say, we were praying behind the Prophet, Maghrib or Isha or Fajr, and the Prophet started by Iqsar al-Surah or by a surah and skipped the Fatiha. None of the reports say that. There is one report that says that. But when you look at the report, it says that this was, number one, it's of doubtful authenticity, but even if authentic, it's probably a report, it's a report that says or claims to have originated from very, very early on. Well, it is entirely possible that the Muslims started praying before the Fatiha was revealed, without the Fatiha, with whatever was revealed from the Qur'an. Then the Fatiha was legislated. But anyway, that report is not very authentic, so we don't rely much on it. Now, they basically say that they saw the Prophet stand in prayer and recite a part of the Qur'an without the Fatiha. Unless the report says, I prayed behind the Prophet Isha, Maghrib or Fajr. How do I know let's assume it's authentic. How do I know what is it exactly that they saw? Number one, why weren't they praying behind the Prophet if it was Maghrib, Isha or Fajr? Two, if they weren't praying behind the Prophet, how do they know what was he praying? I mean, we have reports that the Prophet would pray quite often and pray prayers outside the Sunnah and outside the Fard. In other words, he prays the Fard and prays the Sunnah, and then an hour later just gets up and starts praying. We have numerous reports like that. In fact, to the extent that we have reports that he was once so exhausted by prayer, you know this prayer, reporter, that his feet would swell and that they would tie ropes between the pillars in the mosque so they'll support him because he couldn't stand on his own feet from exhaustion at times. So obviously the Prophet prayed all types of things. Now, how did he know he was praying? Isn't it possible that he was just standing facing the Qibla and reciting a part of the Qur'an and not in prayer at all? Not in a formal prayer. Even if he was doing sujood. Unless it's part of the formal prayer, you can do whatever you want. Let's say I feel like standing up, reading Qul Huwallahu Ahad and then doing sujood. What stops me? Can anyone come and say that's haram, you can't do that? Since I didn't declare an intent to pray, I can do it whatever way I want. I can stand up, I can sing the 99 names of God, and then do sujood, and then get up, and then do ruku', and then recite a part of the Qur'an, and then do sujood, and then get up. No one can stop me, as long as I didn't declare an intent to pray. So they don't explain to us, in the Kufans, what led them to believe that the Prophet was in prayer. The only thing they say is we saw him standing, reciting part of the Quran, then he did sujood. So what? That doesn't prove anything. It doesn't prove anything at all. And that's why I don't think the Kufan report, despite of the fact that, why do we give it importance? Because it's not a Damascus report or an Egyptian report. Why? Because if it's Medinian, Meccan, or Kufan, or Basrian, then we give it a lot of weight. Why? Because a lot of the companions were in Mecca, Medina, Kufa, or Basra. Not that many went to Damascus, and not that many went to Egypt. So when we find an Egyptian report, it depends. Which companion is this going back to? But Kufan or Basrian or Meccan or Medinan, we better be careful, because there were a lot of companions around there. Okay, when you're reading this thing, does this include discussing material learned at the halaqa with friends? Yes, it would. In other words, you don't discuss it with friends. Again, I don't want you hand people information. And if people are not equipped to handle the information, you cannot believe the amount of damage you will be responsible for before God. You might say to a friend, for example, oh, the Kufan said that you don't have to recite the Fatiha in every rak'ah. You might say, understanding the complexity of it. But that friend tells to someone who is someone else, whatever that person is, before you know it, you have a new funky group that says you don't have to recite the Fatiha in prayer anymore. And you've caused a major change in religion. Whether you intended it or not, you're responsible. You're responsible because you did not deal responsibly with the dangerous information in your hand. And that's why you select the people, you warn the people that they are under strict warning not to, until they finish their education. And you trust that they can now carry the responsibility themselves, then they do whatever they want to do with the knowledge. I mean, you're not the censor over it. So yes, it would include discussion with friends. It wouldn't include like this, like you guys talking about it amongst yourself, since you're all a part of it. So I guess the couples can talk between themselves. You can talk to yourself in the mirror. You can go tell people in France about this. You can stop people passing around in the street in France and tell them, let me tell you about... I'm joking. I don't think anyone in France would care very much about any of this. And you could go call Meha Junaidi and inform her about all of this. I know that there's... you guys are very close friends. Okay, any questions, any inquiries, issues? I don't know. I think you should be very careful not to use any of the information from the halaqa. I would choose between the two if you cannot guarantee it, control yourself. But if you can, if you're leading a discussion, it's a discussion. I mean, if you guys are just brainstorming and going back and forth and things like that. As far as habits of learning, the principal obligation is due diligence. Due diligence in trying to find out what are God's commands. Discussions raise questions. Brainstorming discussions. We brainstorm to raise questions. You do not answer anything. Answers must be obtained through this investigative process. But raising questions sometimes is very important, because sometimes you don't know what is it that you're supposed to go look for. And consequently it becomes important to raise questions. And in that sense, that having a discussion might be very healthy and might be very helpful, at least to let people know what is it that they should be thinking about and what is it that they should start researching. As far as the halaqa is concerned, because that's my primary concern, just be extremely careful not to use any of the information from here, or then it's my liability and my responsibility and so on. In our schools, I mean, of course, it's unlikely now because I'm so far away, but theoretically, you do have the power to take away the license of someone's license, if they violate. After the Meha incident, wrote a long letter to several people who issued me ijazas and told them of what had happened in Arizona and things like that. And they said that they didn't think that there's an issue for discipline and so on. But that's actually, if you didn't know the whole origin of the Meha thing, is that I made the mistake of informing Meha in a discussion. It's actually my fault, if you didn't know this. Do you know this whole Meha story? No, okay, well, they'll inform you. I made the mistake of telling her that violations must result in in abrogating an ijaza given to someone. And she knew that I had given Jihad an ijaza to teach the Arizona material. And she had questioned me in the past of how could I give Jihad an ijaza, and if I would give her one. Despite the fact she hasn't studied with me 5 minutes, but that's okay. I said no, I wouldn't give her one. But then when I said that, she said, oh, so what are the requirements for revocation of an ijaza? Then I sensed what was going to happen. So I tried to change the subject. And for 2 hours I couldn't change the subject. But then I'm obligated to answer, because I've opened up I can't police the information once I've admitted someone in. So then I sort of mumbled the information, sort of annoyed greatly, mumbled the information, and that's where the whole thing took off. So now you know. Yeah. In pre-Islamic Arabia, yeah, Rahim was used as someone. It was used to refer to human beings, not any divine being, because you know that the pre-Islamic Arabs had a notion of and Allah, and they believe that this Allah is basically does nothing. I mean, basically created the world and does nothing. There's no hell, there's no heaven, there's nothing. They believed that all the deities interceded on behalf of Allah, and they were the ones who did things. But the idea of attributing this Rahim characteristic to one of these beings was completely absent. And it was even considered, and this is actually an interesting point, in pre-Islamic Arabic poetry, it was considered a feminine attribute. And although many of the pre-Islamic deities, like Illat wal Uzza, were women, they were women or females, but they were females not given feminine attributes. So Illat and Al-Uzza were angry, powerful, spiteful, destructive, so on, all, avengeful. They were not given attributes like the Greek gods, Greek feminine gods of love and muses and beautiful flowers and beautiful things like that. Or they were all described in very stark masculine terms. That's a very interesting point. I mean, and it deserves some study, because why feminine gods but then described in masculine terms? But Rahim was basically an attribute given to human beings, and it was often in poetry designated to people or nearly equated to the point of being confused with generous, kareem. It's as if being generous was also somehow meant being merciful. So you often found in pre-Islamic poetry, one would say, and this man, after his daughter married, set a feast which lasted night and day for 14 days, or for 20 days, or 21 days. In other words, the feast, the celebrations, and the feeding of everyone lasted for 21 days. Truly, this is a person who is Rahim. It's strange for us now after the Qur'an, because the Qur'an came and used Kareem and Rahim as two very distinct things. To us now, it sounds very strange. No, he's not Rahim, he's Kareem. In what sense is he merciful? But pre-Islamic Arabs nearly lapsed the two terms. We don't have pre-Islamic Arabs using Rahim in the humanitarian sense that it is used in after Islam. So pre-Islamic Arab culture did not exalt mercy as a very important attribute. Generosity, yes. Courage, yes. Loyalty, absolutely. Even honesty. But mercy was something that they didn't like very much. It was even considered the attribute of the weak. And consequently, that's why it was wedded to generosity. It's as if the only way you can salvage this idea of mercy. And when you think about it, when you think about these people actually burying their little daughters, burying their little daughters alive, it is not exactly that they're going to be very impressed by someone who feels sorry for his little daughter and doesn't bury her, and they say, oh, he's so merciful. So yeah, the whole notion of mercy as something worthwhile, separate and apart from generosity, is a Quranic innovation. And if, again, it's something that I wouldn't say in the Quran class, but if those who study the Quran really would look at it fairly, it would strike them. It's rather strange. It is not only that the Quran comes in to reorganize a lot of things, but it's bringing in values that seem to have become alienated from society. In pre-Islamic culture, life was too rugged for mercy to be a worthwhile value anymore. In other words, mercy as a value became wedded to generosity, because as an independent value it was nothing. If you, for example, said, and we have examples of this, I kiss my children so often, that was no great virtue. In fact, that was something to be criticized for. We have a hadith like that, as you know, right? The man who comes to the Prophet says, I never kiss my son. And the Prophet says, well, who's not merciful towards our children is not one of us. In other words, you should kiss your son. If you said, I love my wife very much, that I am very merciful, if you meant anything other than I give her a lot of things, in other words, I'm very generous with her, then you would be considered a wimp. If it meant like I never hit her, or she has some type of illness and can't bear children, so I tell her it's okay, don't worry about it, that all meant you're a wimp. If you meant by merciful, that I give her a lot of things, I'm generous, that's okay. And pre-Islamic poetry clearly brings that. When you find someone like, there's another sense, the famous poet Jarir says, I am truly the merciful one with my tribe, for I obtain every victory for them, yet not hold them in my debt. Completely different concept of mercy. I mean, it's not, in other words, he's saying, I don't brag about my victories to my tribe. Without my tribe, they'd be complete losers, because I obtain all the victories, and yet I don't, tell them you owe me everything. And so I'm being merciful. No, maybe you're being generous, but not merciful. So yes, it is a Quranic innovation. Okay, go ahead. Well, one part we know that it became relevant or became an issue right away because the Qur'an itself alerts us to that. The Qur'an says that the non-believers come to the Prophet ﷺ and say, وَمَا الرَّحْمَنِ. Remember that verse? They say, وَمَا الرَّحْمَنِ. And who's that, the Rahman? The reports, as we will get to, inshallah, in future halaqas, because we're going to talk about the verse at some length in the future, not the near future, inshallah. The reports say that the reason for revelation, or is that the Prophet was being harassed about the word Rahman ar-Rahim, and they would come and tell him, what is this, the Rahman? Now you're saying, you're talking gibberish. That's one. Two, Ar-Rahim, their response, actually that's quite indicative. This relates to the question that Anjam asked. That they would say, oh, and if he's a Rahim, then why do you live in poverty? I mean, quite telling right away. The Qur'an employs Rahman and Rahim and Rahmah and Rahim several times throughout. The reports from the Prophet are inundated with Yarham, Rahima, Rahmatan, Rahimun bikum, and so on and so forth. So in other words, several, again, formats of Rahmah. And when we find that in the political turmoil revolving around Osman and Ali, so that's very early, and still people talking about that people did this and did that to Osman and had no rahmah for him, or did this and did that, and whether these people deserve rahmah or not, then it leads one to believe that the concept or the discourses on mercy were there very early. When is the first time that we see the distinction between Rahman and Rahim made? Well, in Tafsir Mujahid, which I have, and Tafsir Muqatil, which I have, both of them written from around 130 Hijrah, so that's the 2nd century. Both of them talk about the distinction between Rahman and Rahim, as if it's well established. Now, some historical analysis would lead us to believe then probably, if they're already talking about it as if it's well established, then perhaps it became well established by the end of the first 100 years. Probably. I mean, for them, it sounds like from things they say that they're talking about a doctrine that's about 40, 50 years old. We don't find the distinction in reports of hadith. That's important, because if the distinction existed, we would have found reports from the Prophet. So between the Prophet and between Mujahid and Muqatil, very important by the way, we do find the distinction in Ibn Ishaq, Ibn Hisham's commentary on Ibn Ishaq. So consequently then it emerged from the time the Prophet died to about 80 years later, where Muslims clearly had investigated the distinction between Rahman and Rahim and come to some. They obviously wanted to understand why this double emphasis, because it's a double emphasis. First you say Rahman and then you say Rahim. And since they always argued that the Qur'an is extremely eloquent and precise, and there's no extra word in the Qur'an, then nothing in there could simply be superfluous. Everything had to have a meaning. Superfluity was not an option. And so, then after that, you have it. I think that there were several things that early Islamic civilization, when we talk about the Islamic revolution, there were several things that Islam, in fact, revolutionized Arab culture about. And then from there, it went on to the rest of the world. One was Shura, because you see the debates about Shura from Uhud onwards. Then around Osman, around Ali, around Muawiyah, all over the place. Two, the whole notion of Tawheed. Tawheed before Shura, of course. The whole idea of femininity and womanhood. It did really completely come with alien discourse. And the whole notion of ilm, knowledge, and the whole notion of rahmah, mercy. These were all things that Islam came in recasted them in completely different terms and created a completely different and novel discourse about them.